Father, we thank you for this day and the grace which brought us here. We pray, Lord, that during this time you would open our hearts and open our minds and expand what we know. Not just that we may gain knowledge, but that we may come closer to you. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right, we're in Jude. We're in chapter 8, verse 8. Jude chapter 8.
That's a counterfeit book.
Exactly. We're in Jude verse 8. If you remember verse 7, verse 7 was talking about primarily Sodom and Gomorrah. We talked about the false beliefs of Sodom and Gomorrah, such as it was based on God punishing them for a lack of hospitality. Not so. But that's what the modern people, that's what's being taught all the time now. Hello, how you doing? So, and we're just starting now. So in Jude chapter 8, and verse 8, I gotta stop saying that. Let me read the verse to start with. And it says, "Yet in the same manner these men also by dreaming defile the flesh and reject authority and revile angelic majesties." The first thing we want to look at right here is when it says, "Yet in the same manner these men." Who's it talking about now? When it says the same manner is happening, or likewise, also you could use right there, that word could translate. Likewise, these same men, who's he talking about? Who are the men he's talking about?
Sodom and Gomorrah.
He's comparing Sodom and Gomorrah to who? In other words, Sodom and Gomorrah was the example.
Right, the dudes who were coming in making a ruckus.
Yes, exactly. The false teachers coming in and in this, whatever this church was. So Sodom and Gomorrah and the Israelites in the wilderness and the angelic falling, things like that, all of those were just examples. Sometimes it's easy to focus on the examples, but the examples were saying, look, these guys were completely off the rail as far as obeying God goes, and yet these are what's similar to these false teachers coming in. So, again, he's talking here about the heretics. And it really, if you think about it, we don't know exactly what these heretics were teaching, although we see from the early verses they're teaching lasciviousness. They were basically, I think, probably almost certainly either antinomians, which we talked about before, or proto-Gnostics. Both of those rejected the idea that sin was really sin, one way or another. They either minimized it or whatever, or said we're covered by grace because we're covered by grace, who cares? The point being is whoever this group was, it wasn't just a little bit, oh, you're off a tiny bit or something like that. Sometimes we got to remember, when people go off the rail on theology, sometimes it's way off. Again, we got to be careful. We have to be careful. Things like, okay, Presbyterians believe in covenant theology. We generally do not believe in covenant theology. I'm not going to sit around and say, yeah, the Presbyterians just like Sodom and Gomorrah or something like that. No, this goes way beyond that as far as what was being taught here. And whoever these people were, Jude really was angry at them. Now, when we start looking at verse 8, we're looking at the characteristics of the heretics. And here's where it gets a little bit tricky in the interpretation. Does anybody have any questions when it says they're these men also by dreaming, or calling them dreamers? Does that sound a little weird? I mean, if I went to you and I said, yeah, these guys are terrible. They're like Sodom and Gomorrah, and they dream also. I mean, you go, wait a second, what are you talking about here? Does it really fit? Does it really follow? The first thing we should be looking at here is saying something doesn't follow. Something doesn't fit. Not only looking at what, and it really does fit in the original, but my point is, when we see this thing of something doesn't fit, that's a way for us to look and say we need to study deeper. When we're talking about hermeneutics, which hermeneutics is the study of essentially how to study the Bible, we want to look for different tip-offs to say, hey, wait a second. Just like, for example, when it says likewise in the beginning. If you see a verse says therefore, that's another thing, a little thing. So there's all kinds of little tips, but this one here, the big tip is, it doesn't really seem to make sense in the English if we just read it, because, okay, they're dreamers, big deal. I'm going to give you a couple possible interpretations here of this, both of which are bad. I mean, the people are bad, not the interpretations, okay? Yeah. Kind of put my foot in my mouth right here. Yeah, please.
Your translation must be different. What verse are you?
Verse 8.
Verse 8.
Yet in the same manner.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm reading from New American Standard here.
I got dreamings, okay.
Dream, yeah. Well, actually, dreaming or dreamers, either way is fine. There, dreaming is technically it's a participle that I would translate as the dreaming ones, if that makes sense. Yeah. So those who are dreaming or the dreamers, either way is fine on that.
Yeah, dreamings in mind. Okay.
Now, one thing we've got to look at there though is what does this word dreamers actually mean? Because if we start looking at it, we find that many people say this word is associated with witchcraft and divination. So dreaming isn't exactly like, oh, I want to do this, or I had a dream at night, or something like that. It's the witchcraft and divination. What you have to look at also is there's only one other use in the New Testament. And I want to be careful before I pin this all on witchcraft and divination, okay? Here's why. The only other use in the New Testament is Acts 2:17, and it says, old men shall dream dreams. Well, that's not witchcraft, that's not divination, and that's like, okay, an old person's dreaming dreams. Now, I think that may have been for Revelation, as far as that goes in Acts, that there's going to be God presenting this, but it wasn't an evil thing, if you see what I'm saying. In the Septuagint, which is the only other place we can really go to in the Bible, and remember, Septuagint is the Greek translation by the Jews from about 200 BC or so, that was made in the Greek. And by the way, I wouldn't call the Septuagint inspired, however, certain pieces of it become inspired because almost every quotation in the Bible you find in the New Testament is from the Septuagint instead of from the Hebrew Bible. So when that happens, it certainly at that point has to be seen as authentic, inspired, at least those verses do. There's actually 20 times you're going to find this in Septuagint. 18 of those times, the word is either used positively or neutral. It's just talking about somebody dreaming, or somebody, dreaming of whatever. So right there again, I'm saying to myself, everybody translate this as dreamers, which is a negative thing. However, in Jeremiah 29:8 and Jeremiah 34:9, in both cases, that word is used negatively and is lumped in with sorcery. So there certainly is a precedent for using this to say this dreaming. Essentially, think of it this way. If you talk about somebody who's playing with rocks, okay, big deal. Well, what if they're actually using those rocks, they're actually runes, and they're reading from those runes to predict, then you're all of a sudden you're into witchcraft. And that's where it's crossing, or crystal divination, things like that. So this is what I'm going to say is, when people say that these dreamers is talking about are actually into witchcraft and divination, that is a definite possible interpretation of this, okay? So I'm not saying it's not, I'm just saying that's one interpretation. The other interpretation, which I wonder about, you don't see as often, but I wonder about is it really saying dreamers and then tying that in with defiling the flesh? In other words, these people are so totally obsessed with the idea of defiling the flesh and doing sexual sins and things of that nature, that because they're so obsessed with it, that at that point in time, they can't think of anything else almost. I mean, you think about it, sometimes you meet people, either they can be into pornography, they can be into sexual sins, they can be all kinds of stuff. It changes the way they think, it changes the way they act. And I'm wondering if this case, that is a possible interpretation of this, is it's not just dreaming, but it's someone who is so caught up in their lust and everything that they just can't get out of it. It's just out of control completely. I would say this. Yeah, go please.
Seems like the NIV is kind of leaning that way.
Please read what that says.
In the very same way, on the strength of their dreams, these ungodly people pollute their own bodies.
Yes, yes. NIV is leaning that way. Most of the other, like ESV and NASB, do not lean that way. They go the other way. I'll be honest with you, I've been studying this for several weeks, and I cannot come to a positive conclusion on which one is right. The biggest thing to say is this, though: whatever it is obviously very, very evil. Whether it's witchcraft and I'll go right to you. Whether it's witchcraft and divination, or whether it's they're so caught up in this that they can't even. All their thoughts are running towards evil. Okay, either way, these people are evil. Linda, please.
I was just going to say, in the original, the word order is also these dreaming flesh.
Right.
So it's like they're together.
That's the reason I tied it. That's the reason I tend to go that way, is because in the Greek it actually says these dreaming flesh. Mm-hmm. Although, yeah, I see that. On the other hand, the way men is there, inserted between them, you can see also the other way. I can see both ways. I agree with you there, but I'm trying to be fair to both sides. Okay, and you know what I mean. I'll explain that to everybody else in a minute here, because it probably made no sense. When I said men, I do not mean M-E-N. Okay, it's a Greek word that's men. It's a different word. We'll talk about that in a minute. Either way, this is something where their defilement and everything else is just such a part of their nature, they can't get out of it. And even if they're dreamers, these are people who are, if it's dreamers who are witchcraft and divination, then it's saying, and they're doing these three things here that are terrible also. So either way, it all gets tied together. It's just two different ways to look at it, kind of, okay? If we look here also, let's continue on for a second. Actually, Did I write down about that? Yeah, okay, we'll come back to that. It talks about defiling the flesh, and Linda pointed that out. It's very clear that it's saying defiling the flesh. The next thing it says is that they reject authority. What are we talking about here, do you think, when we say reject authority? And again, these are characteristics of these dreamers, or it's tied into that dreaming, but go ahead.
It's actually they defile lordship
Okay?
and they reject glories. And they
Well, I'm looking, reject glories is the second one.
Right. But they're all together.
Oh,
in
yeah, you're
that
right.
same-
You're right. Defile lordship. That's even a
That's
better word.
the
They
men-
defile. Yeah.
The men deconstruction is,
Yeah, I'm trying to get.
You're
Yeah,
gonna-
I'm going to get to that definitely.
because that helps understand.
Exactly. I just want to present what they are first, and then I'll do the construction. Yeah, it actually says, it's funny. NASB says reject authority. Defile authority is probably even a better way to put it in the original. So when we say they defile authority or reject authority, what do we think we're talking about here? They don't stop for stop signs, or what are we talking about?
The authority of the local church, maybe?
Possibly. There's some that believe that. I do not believe it's that. But there's some that believe that, and it could be right. Some of the early church fathers actually believe that. I think what it's talking about is directly about rejecting God himself. That they're rejecting God's authority, they're rejecting everything that comes out of this, and in truth what they're doing is they're rejecting the lordship, essentially. So if you think about it also, what are the characteristics of these people? These false teachers are the ones who are bringing in the lasciviousness. What are they doing? It's almost like, yes, I'll take the prize, but I'm not going to go ahead with the work that goes with it. It's almost like easy grace. So what do they do? Think of it this way. Have you ever met anybody, and I actually have, that has said, I'm saved, I can do anything I want now? Okay. That's trying to believe on Jesus as a Savior, but rejecting his lordship. And that's the reason I think this here might be actually tying right into, they're actually rejecting the idea that God has any control over them. Because after all, they've already said, sinner's prayer in our modern days, but they've already said what they have to say, they believe what they have to believe. Therefore, God, you're stuck with me, and you got to work with it, and tough luck, I can do anything I want now. That sounds harsh, but that's what they're doing. I mentioned the example before of the church up in Canada, one of them called Nexus, which the idea on the Canadian church there was that they believed that since they were saved, they had no obligation to do anything else. Everything was covered. And as an example, I know one person told me about essentially one of the people in the church. It's almost like his brain broke when it happened. His church, the youth leader, the youth pastor in the church, was taking him to a strip club. And then finally it just hit him. It's like, what am I doing? And he broke through and understood what was happening at that point in time. But the whole idea with the youth pastor was, hey, I'm saved. I can do anything I want. Strip club, no big deal. No problem. So again, this is something where we think it sounds really far out, but it happens. And not only that, you think about, even if it's not quite that extreme, how many people don't want to study God's word? Because after all, if you learn what God says, he might get to meddling. And we don't want God meddling in our lives. So that's something there where I think, yeah, go ahead, please.
I mean, I agree with all the things that you're saying, but what's not following for me is, if likewise these dreamers, these are people that are coming in and trying to subvert.
Yes.
It doesn't seem to me like they would have the attitude of, oh, I'm actually saved, I can just do whatever I want. It seems more, you
Well,
know.
these are people coming in as teachers, specifically.
But were they coming in thinking that they were saved, or were they coming in trying to break up the church?
No, I think these are coming in thinking they were saved, because if you look at the description early on, you'll find out that, again, they're coming with lasciviousness and things like that,
Yeah.
but yes, they think they're saved. And if you study both the antinomians and the proto-Gnostics, okay, the antinomians, the whole idea behind it was literally, it was against the law. Well, anti doesn't necessarily mean that in the Greek, but in this case, against the law. The point being with antinomian, and by the way, nomian comes from the word nomos. Nomos is the Greek word for law. Should have explained that. It literally means that they said, because I'm saved, I'm covered by grace, and therefore go for it. And if you remember, Paul in Romans 6:1 and other places also, basically, can I do what I want? God forbid. Exactly, that was the whole point. So there were people that thought this way among the antinomians. Now, the Gnostics broke into two groups. And again, I use the word proto-Gnostics because it really wasn't full Gnosticism yet. But these two groups they had, essentially the hedonists and the people who thought that they could whip themselves into submission, okay? If you've ever seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail with the monks, whipping their backs, going, Donna, whatever. Yeah, Donna, Requiem, yeah. Anyway, That is the one group of Gnostics, because they believe because the body is evil, you have to beat the body into submission. Okay? Wrong, but here's the point. The other group of Gnostics is the one that this might be talking about here, is the hedonists. The hedonists believe that because the body is not even real, or the body is in it, body doesn't matter, because after all, God saves us, he's not saving our bodies, therefore the body can sin all it wants to, go for it.
Wow.
As long as the spirit is pure. And I know these things sound weird to us, but yes, there were a lot of groups back then that believed that. Essentially, grace, Jesus was just a ticket to heaven.
Yeah.
You know, pass go, collect $200, and you're off to the races. And that's what they thought of. And again, it sounds strange to us because we've grown up in the church. But I've known a lot of people like that. And again, even if you look at not the wild examples like Nexus, like I mentioned, you can think about a lot of churches that are the liberal churches that don't want to, I mean, we can go right down the street and find churches that have the rainbows all over them and everything else. They're not talking about Noah's Ark and the covenant God made with man. Okay? They are actively celebrating sin. And that's the only way you can put it. They are, you know, they're defiling the flesh. And yet these are people, if you go into that church, I bet most of the people in that church, am I going to heaven? Yeah, I'm going to heaven. They don't know any better. Or they don't want to know any better, either way. So yeah, I do believe that's actually what we had here. And again, these were teachers. These weren't just, sometimes we think, because we do have, you had, for example, in certain churches you had the Judaizers coming in and trying to take them down.
Right.
That's a different situation. This was more of the teachers, the leaders standing up and saying, here's what we got to do. And that's what Jude is reacting to here. Because you're right, in some cases they were, especially the Jews coming in specifically to subvert. Normally when the Jews came in though, the way they were trying to take the church down was into extra laws and extra legalisms, not, hey, I can do anything I want. So that's kind of the difference there. Were you going to say something or not?
No.
Okay, fine.
Well, what time period was this?
Hmm?
What time period was this?
There's disagreement among that. I personally believe that this was probably one of the earlier books in the New Testament for several reasons. We went over that earlier. I think probably 40, 50 AD, somewhere in that area at the latest. Now, others believe it could be as late as 70 or 80.
Yeah.
And that's a fair disagreement. I think there's several things in here, especially one of the reasons I believe it's an early book is if you look at this book, all of these examples are examples that would make sense to the Jews. Many of them, especially Korah, which we're going to come on later, does not make any sense to the Gentiles. So this had to be pretty much an exclusively Jewish church, in my opinion. With it being an exclusively Jewish church, that sets it earlier in time, because by the time you got to about 60 AD, the churches were blended or Gentile churches in many cases. So that's why I date Jude as an early church. But somewhere, certainly first century, no question. All right. The third thing here, aside from the lordship, and by the way, let me say this quickly on the, sorry. The third thing is revile angelic majesties, is the way NAB puts it. Who's got other translations on this? The last phrase, please.
I've got New King James.
Okay.
It says, speak evil of dignitaries.
Speak evil of dignitaries. I'm going to say this, we're not getting into this quite yet, but as we get into verse 9, there is a lot of debate over what these dignitaries are and what these are, because literally, if you look at the Greek doesn't mention angels at all. The Greek literally says about blaspheme the glories. Now you could take that as glorious ones. The word we got here for glories is the word from doxa, which is glory. So
mine said revile the glorious one.
Revile the glorious one. That's a literal translation of that. Not explaining who it was, or it could even be revile the glories, meaning God's glories. So there's 4 different ways you can interpret this at least. And we'll talk about that in a bit. I just want to explain first off what we're talking about. Now I'm going to take a step back to what Linda said about the word men, okay, and the word day, which we haven't gotten to yet. This verse here has a construction in the Greek that you don't see in the English, okay? There's a Greek word to transliterate it, men, okay? Easy to remember, okay? That word does not mean male or female or anything like that in the Greek. That word typically, while it can mean indeed, typically that word it's paired with the word day, D-E, okay? And again, I'm obviously delta epsilon, but DE, we're just keep it in English, okay? When they're paired together, and it is here, it's paired several times, when they're paired together, men is literally saying on the one hand, and day is saying, and on the other hand, okay? Now, it could be to say different from each other, or it could be to say, in this case, you've got 2 days, multiple days following the men. I think what it's saying is, on the one hand, they do this, and they even do this, and they even do this. Because day can be translated as even as well as but. It can be but and even. There's multiple translations for day. So what we're seeing here is a construction which is linking all of these together and just saying essentially, this is bad, but you're not going to believe this, and you're not going to believe this, and you're not going to believe this. And they're all tied together here in this verse 8. And you just don't really see that too well in the English. It comes across a little bit, and it's not the translator's fault either. Because in a lot of cases, if you took and translated everything to get everything out of a verse in the English a lot of times with the translator, you would just end up having verses that were unmanageable. They would just have so many words in them and things like that. They're trying to do their best here. I understand that. But it just doesn't get the complete thought through, if you see what I'm saying. So what we have here, literally, if you're reading it, essentially is, in the same manner, these men, by dreaming, are also, wait, where's the men in there? Let me see.
It's after flesh.
After flesh, yeah. That, by dreaming, they, on the one hand, they defile the flesh, and they even reject authority, and they even reject angelic magistracies, or whatever, however you translate that, the glories, okay? So it's just going further and further and further, just saying these guys are just so far off, it's ridiculous. And I think that's what he's doing. One of the other reasons I say that is because in verses 9 and 10, we're going to hit another midday construction, which is even more obvious. And the point is that Jude is using this. It's a standard way to say things in Greek. It's not the way we would say it in English necessarily. But all of these are linked together. Now let's go ahead and go back to, first, any questions before we go back to the meaning of the glories? Any questions on this verse? Okay, let's go ahead and talk about the meanings of the glories. There are commentators, if you look, including ancient church father types, that have at least 4 different ideas on this. The first one is very similar to what Clint said a few minutes ago. It was early on, but where it talks about revile the glories, where they believed it was civic authorities or dignitaries. Okay? I think the support is relatively weak for that, but that was an early interpretation, so we've got to say, hey, we need to at least listen to it and think about it. Even if we don't agree with it, we got to give it some credence that it could have been that. The second interpretation is ecclesiastical authorities. The problem I have with this is that, think of the church. Can anybody tell me about the church maybe around 50 AD or so? What do you know about it?
Very little.
Very little, yeah. That works both ways, exactly. So what do you know about the church? I mean, cathedrals, everything. I mean, we've seen the cathedrals over in Europe. We've seen them in Rome. We've seen all this. What are we talking about in 40 or 50 AD?
House churches.
House churches, exactly. And if you look at the book of Romans, Paul even talks about, and to all the house churches in Rome, essentially, because when he's writing to the Romans, he's not writing to a church, as in we think of church today. So, as such, also, they seem to have a distributed authority among the elders. We don't find cases of a single elder ruling in a church, and certainly the idea of a bishop or something like that, that came way later with the Catholic Church and things of that nature. So, even though there was an authority, it wasn't like there was just one central authority or one leading for each church, it wasn't one authority or something like that. In light of that, I tend to think that ecclesiastical authorities is kind of reading an interpretation from about 300 or 400 AD back into 50 AD, which is not a good idea. So I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I don't think so. And it certainly doesn't mention ecclesiastical authorities here. You have to read that into it. The third possibility is angelic beings. And these glories could be angelic, basically saying these glories are the ones that are carrying out God's work. Okay? The primary reason for seeing it possibly as angelic beings is twofold. Number one, he's talking about the fallen angels a couple verses before this. And in verse 9, all of a sudden he immediately goes into talking about Michael and the archangel Michael. So that is a distinct possibility, and I would say that's the majority opinion on this thing. If you were to go to commentaries, you're going to find, and not only commentaries, but translations, you'll find that more than any other translation. Was that ESV you were reading from?
RSV.
Which one?
RSV.
RSV, okay. I like the way they handled it in the RSV. Okay, I did like it there. And the reason being is they didn't try to overlay their own interpretation onto it. They left it open-ended, basically, by talking about the glories, okay? Or the glorious ones. The fourth interpretation, which I'll bring up, and by the way, the interpretation number 3 with the angels, one of the reasons also that is a good reason to think this is possibly true, 2 Peter has verses that are very similar to this, and 2 Peter seems to be a little bit more indicating, yeah, these are angels. We're not positive. The other thing I was going to say is, There are many non-canonical books, Jewish apocrypha, let's say, things like that. Also the apocalyptic books as well, that at Jewish times at that point in time did use the word glories to represent angels. Now, does that mean that they're authoritative? No. But it tells us how they were using the word at that point in time in history. So again, I think angels is certainly a distinct possibility, although I'm not ready to jump on the bandwagon and saying yes, it has to be also. The other ancient reading is by a guy named Bede. Bede is about 6th century approximately, was a monk in Ireland or England, I forget which. England? Okay, I'm one of the other, that's right, Patrick of Ireland, and Bede was England. Bede was, for not being a Roman guy, one of the more authoritative guys that you would find back. Surprisingly, in my dissertation, I went back to Bede for some of the things, for interpretations, when I was writing that. And I actually have several pages on what Bede thought about things. So I mean, we're talking about someone who was revered, whether he was right or wrong. I disagree with a lot of stuff, I agree with some other things. But here's what Bede thought, that it meant the majesty of divine power, that the glories were essentially attacking God himself. Saying, you know, you're attacking God's power, you're attacking God's majesties. These glories that you're going in, you're really fighting against God himself, and that's what he meant, okay? I would say this, I don't think we know, for sure. I would probably, I guess, at this point lean towards angels, but only a slight lean. And there's number 5 I'm going to put out, which is, I don't know. And that's a fair one to put out on this one, because we don't necessarily know who this is. Did you want to say something?
Well, yeah, I'm just looking at the way that it's laid out in the original. If you do this construction thing, because when I was researching that, I was like, okay, what does that mean? I don't remember. I had to look it up again. And basically, it's not only do they defile lordship, but they reject glories, and you wouldn't believe it, they blaspheme. So
Right.
I'm assuming that it's both the blaspheming. I don't think you can blaspheme angels, but you can blaspheme God.
You can blaspheme God. Well,
So I think that's both when you really come back to
it's
it.
very possible it's talking about both, God and his messengers.
Yeah.
There's something else I was going to say is, we use the word blaspheme. That word could also be translated as slander. They were slandering. So you could slander an angel.
Mm-hmm.
I don't recommend it, but you could. But the point being is, either way, I think the idea that maybe it's God, his power, his majesties, and those who represent him as well in the angelic realm. I think that'd be a good way of putting it, possibly also.
It's kind of.
That's interpretation number 6, and I think you might have finally nailed it. No, I like that one, seriously, because I don't think we can say positively what this was. But I think we have to remember. Now, the other thing I was going to say is, again, that word glories is used a number of times in non-biblical literature for that way. And something else I was going to say, the Septuagint seems to use it that way. So again, that's something, I wouldn't put the Septuagint quite on par with the Bible itself, but I put that way ahead of all the non-canonical literature, if you know what I'm saying. Because obviously there's something good about it when they were quoting from it in the Bible, in the New Testament. And not only that, honestly, I've seen a number of times when I have trouble with the text and I go to the Septuagint, it's like, well, that makes it more clear. It's easier to handle and stuff like this. So, and again, the nice thing about the Septuagint, whether it's right or wrong, is that it shows you the thought process of people who were contemporary with the words that were written. And I think that's important. And then they were taking the Hebrew and turning it into Greek. So you got to mention that too. But I think it's a good book to go to sometimes. And sometimes we forget to go there when we're looking at what the Bible actually means. Now, the other thing also, which I think comes out of this, is that when they revile the glories, whether it's Christ, whether it's the Lordship, whether it's God, whether it's angels or whatever, their pride is putting themselves above God and above the angels. They know better. They can blaspheme them, they can slander them and everything else because, hey, they're better than the angels are. They know more than they do. After all, I'm filled with grace. Now that I got grace, I can do whatever I want. If I can do whatever I want, I can say it, I can mouth off to anybody I want to. And God, you can't do a thing. But that's joking, by the way. Anyway, but seriously, and if you ever seen, there's an episode of Cheers where Carla's son is going to become a priest. And she comes horrible even for her, okay? And she's tripping people and throwing things at people and everything else. Because, like, God can't do a thing to her because her son's going to be a priest. It's an automatic ticket to heaven. Well, halfway through the episode, he decides it's going to be something else and she's in trouble. But the point is that I keep bringing TV references into it, but it's a beautiful reference when you think about it because it really was the way that these teachers were thinking. I mean, they're almost thinking of it more in terms of an escape clause to turn a profit on life or something. I mean, a moral profit or something, where they can do what they want, but yet they're still saved and going to heaven. That is not what God's talking about. God's talking about a relationship with us, not that. Anyway, that I think covers most of verse 8. Any questions on verse 8? If you do, please yell them out. It's warm in here tonight, isn't it?
How are we ever going to remember all of this?
No. That's your problem.
That's my question.
It's recorded.
Huh?
It's recorded.
Yeah, well, the recording, I forgot about that. Yeah, right. Uh-oh, I gotta watch what I say now. I see your plan. All right. Verse 9. Verse 9. But Michael the archangel, when he disputed with the devil and argued about the body of Moses, did not dare pronounce against him a railing judgment, but said, the Lord rebuke you. Okay, this verse should take about 6 weeks to go through, I think. There's actually a lot of interesting things, but there are some answers here also, okay? Because one of the things you're looking at is, here's Michael, and Michael the archangel, who is one of those powerful beings in the universe, is essentially showing more self-control than these stupid heretics who are here, these teachers who are coming in saying, I know what's best, I can do what I want and say what I want. That's the first step in this, okay? And by the way, before we get too deep into this, how many angels are actually named in the Bible? Anybody know? How many angels do we know the names of? Personal names.
Said 5 or 6 last week.
Gabriel, Michael, and Gabriel. I feel like
None.
No? Well, we know Michael's in there. Talking about it here.
Archangel is different than just.
Well, okay, that's true. Well, archangel, I would say, is a form of angel. We'll get to that. But either way, here's the point. 2 that we know of. You just named them both. That's the only 2 angels named in the Bible. Michael and Gabriel. Okay? Now, there is a distinct difference in that Michael is referred to as a chief angel or an archangel. You're right about that. Gabriel is not. If we look at Gabriel, Gabriel showed up several times. He showed up to Zacharias to tell him about the birth of John the Baptist with Elizabeth. He showed up to Mary to say, Mary, you're going to have a kid, okay? Probably a little more eloquent than that. But anyway, the point is that Gabriel's function was as a messenger. And the thing we have to remember is the root meaning of the word angelos, which is the Greek word for angel, is messenger. Matter of fact, many, many times in the Greek Bible, or the Greek New Testament, the word angelos is used. It's not talking about a spiritual being at all. You know, so-and-so sent a messenger over to tell him to do this or something. That's angelos, okay? And even when you hear the verse about entertaining angels unawares, we don't know if that means a spiritual being, or it could also mean, like, you may have someone who's a messenger of God coming right in. Let's say you've got a pastor you're sitting there doing something for, and you don't even know he's a pastor or something like that, or an elder, or whatever, and you're just going, and you don't even know who he is, but you're entertaining this messenger unawares. Could be human, could be spiritual, could be either one. We don't know. The Michael, on the other hand, even though he's an angel, he's called an archangel, and he has some really, as an archangel, seems to have a different function than Gabriel does. His function is protection. His function is fighting against Satan and things of that nature. In Daniel 10:13, an angel visited Daniel. It was not Michael. Michael was the one who came, and the angel said, I have been trying to get to you for 18 months, but I haven't been able to get here. Satan, the prince of Persia, has been withstanding me, okay? And he said, until Michael came and fought for me and got me through, basically. So Michael was the one who came to fight, and Michael was the archangel who's mentioned there, but he's not the angel in Daniel 10, okay? In Daniel 12, Michael is called the great prince and protector of Israel, which is something we don't think about, but there seems to be certain angels that are assigned to certain territories or groups of people or whoever, for whatever reason. We don't know, and I think it's a stretch to try to say why this happens or whether, but we do know that in this case, with Michael at least, there is definitely, there's definitely something here where he's a protector of Israel. In Revelation 12:7-9, Michael is the one who led the angels against Satan and got them thrown out of heaven. Let me see. I mentioned about that. My point being is that even though they're both angels, they had different functions. And primarily an angel is going to be someone who's a messenger. But one of the reasons I bring this up, we often get caught up, people get caught up on angels and knowing angels and talking to angels and everything. There's only 2 of them we even know the names of. And angels are messengers of God. They're not the thing to be worshipped. They're not the thing to be sought out or something like that. It's for God to decide what the angels are doing. It's not for us to be searching them out as spiritual beings. And the reason I say that is it's becoming more and more popular in churches today to try to commune with angels, meet with angels, etc. We're never told to do that in the Bible. As a matter of fact, I think that actually falls into the dreamers thing, into the divination, witchcraft, etc. Where believers don't realize it, but they're falling into a trap they shouldn't be falling into. Now, one of the things we've got to look at here.
Like, question for you.
Oh, please, yeah.
So in the Jewish tradition, they also name Uriel and Raphael.
Right. There's several others that are, but they're not in the Bible.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you know, like, all I know is that they're angels and they were named in the Jewish tradition.
Right.
Do they hold them as being like warriors or?
In most cases, messengers, I believe, but I'm not sure. I will say this: I didn't go too deeply into them simply because they're not in the Bible.
Okay.
But you're right. I think there's about 5 or so that are named if you look at the non-canonical works as well. And so it is something. The Jewish people seem to have a fascination with angels that I think went beyond what God wanted them to have.
It's like in a prayer that they had for protection at night.
Right.
Adonai, in the name of Adonai, may the angel Michael be at my right, Gabriel at my left, Uriel in front, and Raphael.
And if you think about it, Gabriel isn't even a protecting angel.
Right, exactly.
Right, exactly. And think about this. We can look at that and we go, boy, that's kind of weird. Why would they do that? Okay, well, wait a second. Who do Catholics pray to? Well, could Saint so-and-so do this for me? Could Mary do this for me? Could so-and-so that died do this for me? And not just the Catholics, Eastern Orthodox. I was shocked at one of my friends who actually recently posted, he went to Bible college with me and recently posted about praying to saints and talking with saints. I don't believe that at all.
I've had a Catholic person on some forum tell me that just because the topic came up, because you'll get Christians harping on Catholics for that, like, why are you praying to Mary? And the defense that I read was that they are praying with Mary. It would be like, I don't know if that's true.
It's real, I don't think it is, but I heard Catholics say that.
Well, they'll always say they
Right.
venerate
Right.
saints. Or
Exactly.
They don't worship them.
Right.
There's
But-
a distinction.
There is, but that distinction becomes awful blurry. I agree, they're not worshiping them, but still the idea that we go to human intermediaries in heaven,
Yeah.
I have a problem with that. A lot of that stuff, what they get this from is they get this from the Apocrypha. Books that are, Apocrypha are books that were non-canonical books that were not part of the canon, and there's probably, about 20 of them or so, I think, somewhere in that area. And if you go to, it's funny, if you go to an original 1611 King James Bible, it includes the Apocrypha. It's in there. Now, it does not say that it's canon. It does not say it's part of the Bible, but it does include it as part of the Bible in the 1611 versions. That's why I have to laugh when people say they want to be King James only, 1611 only. It's like, okay, you want me to preach from 2nd Maccabees today or what? And one of my professors said that also. It's not just me coming up with that. So my point being is that I think they're getting it from extra biblical sources. The other thing you have to remember too is, let me say something about the Catholics. It's going to sound really weird to you. I had a Greek professor, wonderful professor, one of the best I ever had. It's actually in Bible college for him. And he was talking about the fact that he got his doctorate from Catholic University. And people are, well, why did you get a doctorate from Catholic University? And not only that, how can you learn from them if his doctorate was in ancient languages, okay? And actually, we're good in ancient languages. But he actually confronted the priest one time that was teaching the classes, and he said, you're interpreting this wonderfully. How can you do this? Because you don't believe this. And what he said is, I'm interpreting the Bible as it's written. But the Pope had the ability, and the Church Fathers had the ability to modify the Bible, so therefore what they teach as far as Catholic practice is not based on the Bible, it's based on the Bible plus modifications. And that's why they can have a different, that's why they can be wonderful interpreters at times. All right, if you want to go to study 1 John, in my opinion, the best, what's the guy's name? Brown, yeah, Raymond Brown. Probably the best works ever done on First, and John also, best works ever done. If you want to go to Luke, what's his name?
What are these people commenting?
These are people who wrote commentaries, big commentaries. Like, let me say this, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, tiny little books. Brown's book is like 1,600 pages of small print, okay? Oh yeah, it is, and but it's amazing what it has in there. The Greek is wonderfully unfolded and things like that. I disagree with him on some things, but here's the point: why can he be a great commentator and yet be so off on and be a Catholic priest at the same time? because he can look at the Bible and say this is what it meant at the time it was written, but the Bible doesn't mean that anymore because now it's been modified by the Pope and by not just the Pope, but the
Councils.
Yeah, the councils, exactly. The councils have put out things
The
like that.
interesting thing I found about the Pope is that he's supposed to be a modern day prophet, right?
I don't know that they use that word.
I don't think they use the word.
Yeah. But basically the idea is what we got in the first century church is no longer what the Catholics actually observed. They observed that plus modifications.
Okay.
So that's why you can get off here on what Catholics believe, and that's why it's different as far as
Okay.
that.
I've always heard it explained
Peter.
the tradition or what the popes and the councils say and what the Bible says are of equal weight.
Right, equal weight. Well, equal weight, except then they say what happens is the one that comes last is the one that takes precedent because they're saying the Bible is correct, but now it's been modified because this is the later proclamation. So that's your
That's
equal
another
weight.
way of looking at it.
Right, equal weight, but some are a bit more equal. Not to steal from Animal Farm, but yeah.
You're saying that the Pope has the power or authority to
In Catholic,
write what the
If,
Bible says?
if he's doing what's called speaking ex cathedra, which literally means from the throne, that means it is authoritative and it is the same as the Bible as far as inspiration goes, yes.
But when he says the war in Ukraine is immoral or something, that's not speaking.
That's not ex cathedra. So therefore, it's only things that are said from the throne, which is a specific way to do it. But the point is that either way, you know, am I going to trust this pope or any of the popes compared to what the Bible says? No. Yeah. So let's go on from this, but that's what's happening here with the Catholics and what I mentioned. But now let's get back to this. This verse here, verse 9 and 10, first of all, you really need to see 9 and 10 together, okay? But verse 9, when we're looking at it, is that, number one, Michael is speaking to someone who was stature-wise, even though Satan had turned evil, stature-wise very important, okay? Someone who was created as an important person. So you could look at it that way and say that's why he doesn't slander against him. I'm not sure I entirely buy that, but that's certainly the most common interpretation, okay? The other thing I would say is he actually did rebuke Satan, but not by his words. He rebuked Satan by saying, the Lord will rebuke, okay? And by the way, for modern application, I think there is a big application here. While it is not common, exorcisms do happen, Protestant and Catholic, deliverance, exorcism, whatever you want to say. If you're in an exorcism or that situation with a deliverance or something like that, and you're trying to do it in your own power, you are going to get mauled or fail or whatever. It has to be done in the name of Christ. It has to be very specific. And again, this is not something, the average Christian, it's not something you want to be involved in. But the point I bring up is, it's something we can learn from. And here's the other thing too is, even if you step down from exorcism, there are times when people will say things that we just go, that's outrageous. You know something, maybe the best answer is, you may believe that, but here's what God says. Instead of fighting in our own way. Now, I'm not saying we can't reason with them, etc. But sometimes it's just a matter of saying, here's what God says. I'm going to leave it there.
Reason with who?
Oh, people. I'm not talking about exorcism now. I'm talking, if we step back from it, certainly in an exorcism, there's no reasoning at all. You don't reason with the demon.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you're right. What I'm trying to say is, if you step back to even just, thoughts on, is it right or wrong to be, to have transgenders in women's locker rooms or something like that? Well, you know something? If you throw God out of the equation, it's neither right nor wrong. Because honestly, what's it based on? Then it's everybody's own morality. On the other hand, what I can say is, look, I've seen what God said about this and it's wrong. You don't have to believe that, but I've seen what God says. Now, again, I can say that friendly, I can say that in love, but I also think, it's something where we can say that and learn from this. But there's something else that we have to look at here that's not coming through in English again. In this verse, the words that are being used in this verse are words that would be used in a court scene. Okay? And if you think about it, Michael is essentially the prosecutor or the advocate for the prosecution. Satan is the defender, okay, or the defense attorney. Who's the judge? Easy one now. Who's the judge? 3 letters, starts with a G. Okay, you got it now? God, okay. Now think about it. Let's say you were the defense attorney in a court case here in Anne Arundel County. And you stand up and say, this scumbag, I'm the prosecutor, not defense, I'm the prosecutor here, this scumbag belongs in jail. And I'm pronouncing right now that he's going to jail for 10 years. Well, the judge will look at you and I need to end up with a contempt citation. Because it's not the place of either advocate. They can advocate, but it's not their place to pronounce the judgment. If we think of it in these terms, all of a sudden, verse 9 becomes, oh, wait a second, I see what he's saying here. He didn't pronounce the judgment because it was not Michael's place to pronounce the judgment. Now, why is he bringing this up here, and why is it important? Because Michael was acting within the bounds that were established and within the propriety that should be observed. On the other hand, these heretics that came in, they had no bounds. They were just doing anything they wanted to. And that's the difference he's trying to point out here, and that's what kind of gets confused sometimes. What we kind of lose in this is that these bounds we're talking about here are the bounds that Michael's doing what he should be doing. But again, it's a court scene, and that's why it's not real clear. Again, in the English, you could kind of read it into it, but it really doesn't come out that. I want to say disputed, that word in English. Well, I had an argument with him, right? That's dispute in English. Not in the Greek. That word for dispute is actually a word that's specifically a court usage in that word. So when we look at it that way, yeah, please.
Just show my ignorance.
No, it's okay.
In the Old Testament, or where is this? Is this referring to someplace else in the Bible?
About Moses? We're going to get to that. Yes.
So, Zechariah
Right.
3:2.
We are definitely going to get to that in just a moment. I'm trying to set the scene first, but not, by the way, I never thought of ignorance and you in the same breath, so don't.
In this particular instance.
No, but I love hearing what you have to say about history especially. My point is this, is that when you look at this, here's the scene, and that's why I tried to bring this up first, because now we're going to look at, now that we've seen the scene, and by the way, before I say this, the other contrast, Michael is acting within the bounds of propriety that he should be acting with. Verse 10 talks about, and then you got these heretics who are just, so verse 10 goes right back into the same message. Now, what is this thing about the dispute over Moses' body? Okay? Doesn't that sound a little weird to you and me?
Yes.
Okay, it does, let's face it. And again, a court scene makes a little more sense here. But would somebody turn to Deuteronomy 34, verses 5 and 6? And as soon as you get it, read it out loud. Not technically about the body itself, the whole thing, but please read about it. Deuteronomy 34, 5 and 6.
I got it.
Okay?
And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is.
Ah. So nobody knows where Moses is buried. And they still don't know where Moses is buried. Okay? So the reason I bring this up is that for some reason, Moses, I'm not saying this is a dispute here, but for some reason, Moses was buried secretly. Abraham, they made a little monument to him and everything. Other people, they did. And you got to say, why was Moses buried secretly? And the answer is, we don't know. But I'm going to give you some ideas on this, okay? Many Jewish apocryphal texts and apocalyptic texts both mention this situation, not just the burial, but after the burial, this dispute with Michael and with Satan, okay? The non-biblical ones do frame it as a legal dispute again, and the non-biblical ones basically are saying that Michael was arguing that Satan doesn't get the body of Moses. Now, I got a question for you. Why would he want the body of Moses, and what was he talking about with it?
Has he brought anybody back to life yet?
Moses?
No, Satan.
Satan? No. And he didn't want the body to bring it back to life either.
Okay.
He wanted the body for some reason. Any ideas? I have my own ideas on this.
So,
Go ahead.
I mean, Moses, it goes on to say, right, God spoke to Moses face to face like a friend,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that no one is like Moses. So is there, was there some protection there to hide where he was buried so that people weren't start like worshiping his bones?
That's possible.
Like, oh, I need to touch
Yeah.
the bones of Moses.
Yeah, he's still got God's glory on him. That's very possible for the burial.
Yeah.
But why would Satan want the body?
Well, he could either like hype
Make it
that
a worship
up,
scene. Okay, yes.
right?
Yeah. Moses land, come visit the
Right.
bones. Exactly. I got you.
Well,
Yeah,
also like,
Step right up.
so you guys hold on Moses, but I've got his body right here. It's
Yeah. Let me throw something else at you, too. Think back maybe 200 years in U.S. history, okay? And you got the slime bag who comes into town, who robs the stagecoach, who robs the bank, who shoots 3 children just for the fun of it and everything else, and finally the sheriff knocks this guy off. And then they take and build a beautiful mausoleum for him, right? And bury him, right? What did they do back then? They hung him, but what did they do after they hung him? What did they do with the body?
Buried him in Boot Hill.
Boot Hill, okay, but that's one spire in Arizona. But what did they do with it? Well, what about the grave?
Stake or something like that?
No, no.
Birds eat 'em?
No, that's more into science. That Twilight Zone had a great one on that one, but that's the point. No, the body was often usually put in an unmarked grave. You didn't get a giant, and here. Now, sometimes they did mark it, but often these bad guys, they're deliberately put in unmarked graves. Why? To desecrate their memory. Now, I'm not saying this is true. I'm just saying this was the thought process. This has been a thought process not only a couple hundred years ago in the U.S., this is the thought process in many cases throughout the ancient world back then also. The body was considered sacred, and the body would be venerated through the burial, okay? Not even saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that was their thought processes. And I'm not even talking about the Jews back then. You can go to the Babylonians, you can go to the Egyptians. What did the Egyptians do with their kings? Well, they mummified them. We're still finding their bodies now, okay? So one possibility, which is a realistic possibility, is Satan wanted to just somehow either desecrate Moses' body or do something that would make the body so it was just, unmarked grave or whatever. I don't know what. But somehow desecrate him and maybe, tie him to the back of the stagecoach and run him around Jerusalem. Not stagecoach. You know what I'm saying.
Modern day example, in the Soviet Union, when Stalin died, they had Lenin and Stalin in this huge mausoleum together.
Yeah.
But then Khrushchev made this speech in 1956, Stalin was bad. So they moved him out of the mausoleum and buried him in Red Square with a whole bunch of other people in these tiny little graves.
And don't even talk about Ryan Trotsky. He's even taken out of the photographs.
He didn't even get that.
I know. He literally, they airbrushed him out of the photographs on that one. But yeah, you're right. They move him around, essentially desecrate the body, make him unimportant. We don't know what Satan had in mind here. I have another idea behind this, okay? I haven't found it in commentaries.
You're not saying that the people that hid, whoever.
No, they did fine. They did what God
just
wanted.
trying to protect
Right.
them, right?
But after this hiding somehow, there was we don't know what it was, but from Jude we know, it wasn't just the apocryphal literature of the Jews. There was some dispute between Michael and Satan over the body of Moses. What it was, we can't say for sure. But let me throw a suggestion. Actually, before I do that, let me say this. Let me throw a suggestion at you. Is there anything in New Testament history, not Old Testament, that Moses was part of? I'm not talking about the law of Moses or anything else.
Transfiguration.
Transfiguration. If you somehow stole the body of Moses and got rid of it or something, or put it through a meat grinder or whatever, it might have been Satan's way of trying to stop the plan of God by saying, Moses is coming back and Elijah's coming back. If I get Moses, he's not going to be there. I'm not saying it would have worked. And also, I can't find that in any commentary, so I can't back it up and stuff, but my personal opinion is I think this was a direct attempt by Satan to sabotage the plan of salvation by sabotaging Moses' ability to come back at the Transfiguration. Because if Satan had Moses' body, for whatever reason, and wasn't going to release it, Moses wasn't coming back for the Transfiguration.
How would that affect the plan of salvation then?
Well, the Transfiguration was when Christ was glorified, and it's just part of the whole process. If the Transfiguration didn't happen, I don't mean to say that Transfiguration is what made us salvation, okay? But this is obviously part of God's plan for the life of God, for the life of Christ, and what was going to happen. Go ahead, please, and go ahead.
I was actually just sitting here thinking, with Moses meeting Jesus Christ, he, the giver of the law to the people from God, is absolutely endorsing Jesus Christ in the new covenant.
Yeah. Now, I do find one other interesting thing, too. When Moses met with God, remember, face to face, okay? And he actually showed his turn so God wouldn't see his face.
Right.
I was teaching this one time and I accidentally said that God showed Moses his backside. And somebody was like, he mooned Moses or what? The reason I bring this up is what happened to Moses' face after that for a while? Glow. They had to put a veil over him to stop the people, they couldn't handle it. Christ seemed to have the same kind of effects after Transfiguration. So I'm not saying they're connected necessarily, but there's something about being in the presence of God that changes a person there. And obviously, Christ was God and man both, but something happened at the Transfiguration where he was in some fashion. I use the word glorified. I don't mean in the final sense of having the glorified body going to heaven. Don't get me wrong there. But there was something that happened at the Transfiguration that was special and part of the plan. Part of the plan of God, of the life of Christ. And if you screw up the life of Christ, you screw up the plan of salvation, is what I'm trying to say. So it's not a direct, it's like if you take the Transfiguration out, salvation didn't work. Sorry, God. I don't mean that. But still, think about it. If Satan knew God wanted to do that, well, what a way to attack God's plan. than to go after the one of the two people who was actually going to come back.
Well, Satan didn't really know what God's plan was.
You're right.
So, therefore, he might have thought something would work. It
Yeah.
wouldn't.
I don't think there was any chance it ever would have worked. But he thought it was something so important about the body of Moses, I believe, that therefore he felt it was worth going after. Because I really don't believe that there's an argument after every Christian dies, you know, and Satan's trying to get that Christian's body or something. This is special to Moses, whatever it was.
I'm unfamiliar with transfiguration. Is that
Transfiguration, yeah,
torture?
that's in the Gospels. And basically, he went up to a mountaintop and he met with Elijah and Moses. He took 3 disciples with him, was Peter, John, and James. Yeah.
I think.
And basically, and he was visibly changed at that point in time as well. And it seemed to be the point in time when he changed where his ministry focus was and everything else as well.
Okay.
So something happened there. You know, as far as that, you can read more about that in the Gospels.
Oh, okay.
But also the point of it is high Jewish Christology, in that
Yes.
here is Jesus with these 3 figures from the Bible, and then the cloud descends,
Right.
and only Jesus is left.
Yeah.
Wow. The others didn't make it, but Jesus did.
Yeah. And not only that, again, if you look at John's right about that, and you look at it, you'd probably be hard pressed by 2 more important figures than Elijah and Moses.
Yeah.
And that was really, you know, that was up there. So I think that's what, again, that's a personal opinion there. You don't have to agree with it. There's other possible explanations like the one we brought out. We don't know the truth of what was going on with the body and why he wanted it. But those are a couple of possibilities. Whatever it was something that was important to Satan, and it was something that was argued about. So again, it could be desecration of the body. It could be who knows what. Not only that, maybe he thought he could stop Moses from being resurrected someday. I don't know. You just don't know. Now, what I was going to say is, verse 10 ties in with verse 9, but I'm looking at the room is hot tonight, and we've gone an hour. Normally we're shooting for 1:15 normally, I think, but we're going an hour. And I was going to say, with the hot room, would you like to break it here for tonight?
Yeah.
I thought so,
Sure.
yeah. It looks like it. The room looks interested, but also, you know, okay. So let's go ahead and stop here. We'll pick up verse 10. I'll say this also, we're not getting through verse 10 in 15 minutes next week. Yeah,
I was gonna say, since we're ending at the end of
Please.
verse 9.
yeah,
Well, that word, may he, when Michael says about God, may he rebuke you,
yes.
that's future.
hmm
So I'm wondering if this is gonna happen like at the final judgment, or?
I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. I think it's, I'd have to look. I wonder if it's a pluperfect. There's only 1 or 2 of those in the New Testament, where basically it's future from the standpoint of the person who wrote it. I haven't looked at this at all as far as that goes. But in other words, I think he's talking about a past. In the past, it was a future thing, if that makes sense. In other words, it was still future. He's writing about a past event, talking about a future event from that past standpoint, which it sounds uncommon. It's not as uncommon as you think to think that way in Greek. Greek doesn't really think in times of time the way we do typically. It's more what we call aspect, which I'm not going to go into now, but the aspect of the word is different from the time. There are some Greek, like the future, which is usually pretty clear of the future, but you could have a future that occurred in the past, if it's set properly, and things like that. Not only that, we have the, the present, the past. It's when you use a present tense verb to speak about the past. I don't know why I can't think of it. I use it all the time. Anyway, here's the point. We do it in the English too, and we don't realize it. It happens a lot of times in the Greek New Testament, where the present tense is being used to describe past events in some cases, and here's why. Let's say I'm telling you a story, okay? When Linda and I got married, we got married, and it was the 6th of April, and it was 1996, and we had this photographer. And this photographer, you know what this guy does? He takes this thing right here, and he does this horrible wedding video, and you wouldn't, I mean, it was a joke. We almost thought it would send into America's Funniest Home Videos type thing. But this guy did these horrible, do you notice what I just did there? I changed from the past tense to the present tense without even noticing. We do that all the time in English. It happens in the Greek too. And we don't think about it that way, but the Greek does that. I believe Romans chapter 7 is a good example of a past event being described with present tense verbs by Paul, talking about something that happened in the past in his life. And I think it's a good reason for that. I'll get right to you. But yeah, go ahead.
I would say, isn't that a way to like emphasize it? You're
Yes,
like,
that's
when
exactly why.
You're getting in the moment.
You got
you're
it.
Like, right now.
You got it. But it's actually fairly common in the Greek New Testament. And so it's not something that's, I'm not coming up with some wild new idea or something like that. If you go to Greek grammar, they're going to talk about it. I don't know why I can't think about it. I've used this word all the time until, oh no, that's this. And it's going to mind right now. I'm not even in my hundreds yet either. Anyway, but seriously, what I can say, it's not uncommon to see that. So you might have, I think this is actually talking about a past event. I think the argument happened over Moses' body. I can make sense that it did. And not only that, again, the Jewish non-biblical literature writes about this quite a bit back then. So it already happened. But from the standpoint of when he's telling the story, it's something that's God's, he's saying, God will rebuke you essentially.
It's quotation, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I'd have to look. I don't know if this is it. There's only one or two places where it's a pluperfect, and it almost fits that instead of a perfect. But I could be wrong on that also. I mean, I'm just taking a guess here, because if you study Greek, when you hear this word pluperfect, forget I even said it. I mean, there's like one or two of them in the New Testament, and literally the Greek teacher will tell you, just memorize those verses. I mean, literally, they don't even worry about worrying what a pluperfect is, because it's so rare. But I think that if it's not a pluperfect, it is what the idea of the pluperfect is, I think, if that makes sense. Anyway, time-wise, Greek-wise, I'm taking time now. The Greeks don't think of time the same way we do as far as when we write Greek. So, anything else? That's a good point, by the way.
Well, they had a lot more time and they weren't so distracted, probably.
Maybe so. We do have a lot of distractions, I'll give you that one. Of course, we can get from place to place quicker, too. Try being ancient Greek and getting to London in 8 hours or something like that, All right, or even it would be a half-day trip for us to get home from here tonight if we had to walk it, or hitch the camel. Which they probably didn't actually use back then.
Sounds kind of peaceful if you ask them. So.
Yeah.
Right.
Lifestyle.
I understand. It could be in some ways. All right. Why don't I go ahead and close this in prayer, and then we'll take off tonight. Father, we thank you that you love us. We thank you for giving us your word. We thank you that we can learn from it. We thank you that we can apply it. And we thank you that you are almighty, that you control all of this. Thank you for what you've done, and I ask you to bless us through this week and have us focus on you in Christ's name. Amen. That's the other thing too with all of this stuff. We're learning this, but I think the purpose of this is to see the power of God, the might of God, the care of God, the fact that we have a relationship with him, which is not simply, get out of hell free card or something like that. So again, all of that seems to emphasize. The other thing too to remember too is these letters were written to us, I think, to some degree, because we face some of the same problems in the churches today. I don't mean that we have people in this church doing that.
You're not talking about Jude here, are you? Or are you?
In Jude.
Was Jude one of the letters?
Yeah, Jude is a letter in the New Testament.
Is that the same as the 6 or 7 letters to the churches?
No, it's totally different. Most of the books in the New Testament, majority of them are actually letters written to churches.
Oh, I didn't know that.
The Gospels are written differently. Acts is different, but many of the other ones were letters either written to specific churches or general letters to the churches, with the idea being that there's a problem in the church. It's funny how many of these address problems. Some of them are just nice letters, but most of them are addressing problems. Go to Galatians is a good example that I use. Galatians is not warm and fuzzy, okay? Yeah, Galatians is a butt
foolish
kicker.
Galatians.
Exactly. It's saying, not only that foolish Galatians, I really translate that literally in our English sense would be you stupid morons. Yeah. And that's really a better translation of it. So, yeah, there's a lot of that. So, anyway, like I said, I'll talk to you if anyone wants to talk, but like I said, you're free to go if it's too hot also. Don't worry about that.
Hey, John.